On this episode of Survival Dispatch News, we've got a great panel to discuss what to look out for in the following months as far as preparedness. This Survival Dispatch video is brought to you by Nutrient Survival. Nourish your body, power your mind. And we're back with Survival Dispatch News. If you haven't met me before, my name's Chris. I'm with ammo.com, and I have a spectacular panel today to discuss the top 5 things that you need to be preparing for this coming month. With that, we have Mike Shelby joining us today from Forward Observer. Glad to have you here, Mike. He is an excellent source of information, and we're really going to lean on him for this discussion. We've got Dr. Jennifer Stankus with us here today, as well as a subject matter expert. And of course, the Dean of Demolition, Mike Sterling, is here, our EOD technician. So before we get into this, if you like this type of content, please make sure you get down there and click that like and subscribe button. Click the bell icon right next to it to get notified every time we upload new content. But Mike, there has been a lot of things going on around the world lately. Let's get started. What is it that we need to be looking out for this month?
Well, just for this month, I mean, kind of a short list for just looking at things this month. But it's summer. There's always going to be issues with power availability. This country, the United States, has the same exact electrical generation capacity that it had in 2011. Federal government's been bringing down power plants. The energy regulatory commissions have been warning about power outages this summer. For 2/3 of the country, I have 2 freezers full of beef. That's a very important topic for me. So, I'd say just for this month, that's probably my number one concern.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Obviously, the power grid is a point of concern for a lot of preppers. I know it's something that we always are concerned about, whether it be rolling blackouts, which are obviously the more likely scenario, or something more drastic, such as a CME or something like that. Of course, that's going to be incredibly rare. But Dr. Jen, touch base with us here. You obviously have a lot of experience. You're former LEO. You're a veteran of 2 different branches of the military. So tell us, what are you looking at as far as making sure that you can keep the lights on?
Yeah, so I agree. Refrigeration is important, but we see a lot of people die from heat exposure every year, especially elderly people. It's nice if you have the capacity to have a generator so that when power goes down, you can live off the grid and do just fine, but not everyone has that capability. So just really knowing where you can go in that instance, if you need to get out of the heat.
Yeah, I think heat is a big issue, especially lately, with things going on. I'm sure Mike has more hot topics to discuss here in a minute. But it's someone who's dealt with the heat, who's been overseas quite a bit. Mike, what did you do when you were in the field, disarming mines and stuff like that to keep yourself cool?
I sweat.
That's fair.
I sweat a lot. Yeah, and I agree with Mike that this time of year is very bad for this sort of thing. And I've got several contracts with a bunch of energy companies working on trying to get new power plants up and running, and it's just the regulatory hurdles are a nightmare to have to go through. It's crazy. I've sat in a couple of those meetings and just gone, man, I'm gonna go back to dealing with the ordinance. It's safer. But yeah, trying to stay cool is a big thing. If you're hopefully in a house that has ventilation is your key. I know so many people that they'll be like, oh, it's so hot in here, but their house is all sealed up. Okay, well, at a certain point, you're going to have to actually open those windows. You're going to have to try and stay cool. You're going to have to not wear, the restrictive clothing as much as is possible. And kind of like a lot of what we did in the Middle East was, it's the same as Mexico. Daytime is, you got your big siesta chunk there in the middle of the day. Mike, I know that down in Texas, man. I mean, it is brutal down there with a capital Brew in the summer. And as a matter of fact, when I was stationed out there in Texas, we used to we would take midday off, and we would actually spend a lot of time working nights because it's just too hot to work during the heat of the day a lot of the time. So rest cycle during the worst of the heat. Work early, work late.
Definitely really great pieces of advice. I would say recently, actually, here in Indiana, we had a rather short power outage. If you've been keeping an eye on things, we had another tornado run through my neck of the woods, and our power was actually knocked out for 5 hours last week, or last weekend, rather. So that was a little bit of an excitement. But one of the things I would say, obviously, we're talking about opening up the windows from a chemistry standpoint, convection, open those top windows to let that hot air escape out of your house. Try and help that natural airflow will definitely help. And of course, if you have to work outside and you still have some, aspects of power, such as water pressure, putting a cold washcloth around your neck, a good way to help kind of relieve that heat, that body heat, and make you feel a little bit more comfortable if the power goes out. But hopefully you'll have warnings about rolling blackouts, but you may not. So being ahead of that game is a good thing to do. So have things in place like flashlights, candles, and just be ready to take on that heat if it happens. Mike, what else have you got for us?
Well, looking a little farther than a month out, later this year, early, maybe first quarter next year, is recession. This is something that economists and investors have been talking a lot about for a year. As a matter of fact, Biden just told he's actually in Chicago today to give a speech on Bidenomics. That's apparently going to be a core part of his campaign. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me campaigning on the economy when it is showing signs of deterioration in some areas. And a number of investment banks, actually almost all the investment banks we track, probably close to a dozen of them, have said that they expect a recession in the second half of this year, probably closer to Q4 or first quarter 2025. And I can just go down the list here. HSBC, mild recession this year. JP Morgan, recession fourth quarter 23 or first quarter 24. Bank of America, mild recession in first quarter 24. Mild recession in Q4 23 from Deutsche Bank. BlackRock, with $9 trillion in assets under management, they say mild recession this year. Standard Chartered said 70% chance of recession by Q1 24. So I do think we're staring this in the face. The only question for me is this going to be longer than average? Is it going to be deeper than average? Is it going to be mild or wild?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Obviously, on all of preppers' minds, one of the doomsday scenarios is an economic collapse. Now, of course, we're talking recession, which is a little bit different. And actually, we're recording this on Wednesday, the 28th. Powell came out today, the chair for the Fed, and said that they're expecting a soft landing, but they're not ruling out the potential for a recession. I love the rhetoric coming out of the Fed and things like that. So, Mike, let's start with you. Obviously, you have things to say about that, I can tell. And then we'll follow up with Dr. Jen. What are your thoughts on a recession for this year?
Well, personally, I think we're already in a recession. Being a small business owner, and this actually hit me recently. If you're a small business owner and you survived the last 3 years, the chances are that you're going to have debt. Well, so many of these banks just took it in the short so heavily that everybody, all the remaining banks are just scared to death. Well, at this point, businesses like mine, where you have to have a solid financial partner to work with because you do a lot of works up front and you have to front the money. Banks are not loaning to small businesses that have any debt. And if you're a small business that survived the last 3 years, you have debt, period. That's all there is to it. So small business being the cornerstone of U.S. industry and the economy, you're getting ready to see a whole lot of small businesses, just even more than we've seen over the last 3 years, go by the wayside just because of lack of liquidity.
That's definitely a good point. So I think the big thing we can take away here is make sure you support your local small business whenever you can. If you've got local farmers markets, things like that, make sure you go in there and trying to do your best to help them stay in business, because that's really the cornerstone of your community. Dr. Jen, tell us, as far as a recession, what are you seeing? What are you thinking might be some things we might run into if that were to happen?
Just from a health perspective, I think that it's pretty anxiety producing for people, especially people who are like really right on the edge and aren't sure how they're going to make ends meet. And just, making sure that you're taking care of of that and, not looking for drugs or alcohol or other things that are going to make things worse, but, stay healthy, stay active, be connected with people, especially like-minded people who can help you through that. And, this is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, as you know, also, which is a huge deal for our veterans. But then the other thing is just really prioritizing your money and how you're spending money. For me, we do keep a lot of food storage, and, beans and legumes and rices and things like that are really cheap, and you can live a really long time on those, and even improve your health by eating those things, and save a lot of money too. So just I'd say mental and physical health when you're going through psychologically and also stressful times, just from a financial standpoint.
That's a really good point that I think a lot of people don't think about is the mental aspects that an economic recession can have on you, whether, like what Mike was talking about with, potential business failings, that obviously is going to hit you really hard. Or if it's like, if you lose your job, where's your next meal going to come from? If you have some of that food storage built up, that's a great insurance policy. And that's obviously something that we talk about here on Survival Dispatch, is making sure you build up that survival cache of food and things that you need, essentials, to make sure that you can get through a disaster like this. And recessions can last some time. If we remember back to 07, 08, it was not a quick thing. It wasn't here for a month and then it was gone. So in my opinion, if something like that were to happen, we're probably going to see prices go up. So it's better to buy it now when it's cheaper, if you have the financial ability to do so, and put it away. Like Dr. Jen was saying, these staple foods, pretty inexpensive, relatively speaking, right now, to other things like steak. Don't get me started on that, Mike, you with your big freezer full of steak. So we're coming to Mike's house for the barbecue later. But definitely, have those things back. And if you need to dip into your preps, do it. That's why you're prepping. So have those things on hand, ready to go in case, the economy takes a bit of a dip.
Yeah, and if you weren't gardening before,
that's a good time.
Now's the time to be gardening. I'll tell you, I preach it all the time. Make those mistakes now when you can make a 75-cent mistake versus making that mistake, a year from now, when your mistake in the garden results in sitting there watching your children starve, which is going to tear any of us up. And just like you were saying, Chris, working amongst a group of folks, if you can get that mag together, man, many hands make light work.
Oh yeah, for sure. We just built a standing or a raised bed here at my house, and it was a job and a half. And if I had a couple extra hands, it would have made life a lot easier, for sure. All right, Mike, let's keep it going. And just as a heads up, guys, if you're not subscribed to the Forward Observer YouTube channel, please make sure you do so. We'll make sure we put that link down in the subscription. Lend them a hand, because they're giving out some amazing information and they wanted to share it with us. All right, Mike, so what's number 3?
Well, can I just make one final point on the recession here? So the average recession is about 10 to 11 months. Mm-hmm. And so I've seen some calls of maybe a 6-quarter recession. That's a year and a half. So substantially longer, maybe 50% longer than average. And that's just one call. But I would say, that's probably closer to a worst case scenario. Just me personally, I would much rather be planning for an 18-month recession than an 11-month recession too. So, that's kind of far out there. And the timing is still a big question mark. We don't know obviously exactly when it's going to happen. I tend to agree with Mike. I think some of the numbers, the official GDP numbers coming out, I think they could be massaged to make it appear that those numbers are stronger than they are. Ultimately, though, this goes back to federal spending. The federal spending drives so much of U.S. economic growth, and so when we talk about the debt ceiling, they're going to apparently, I think, in October of this year, maybe have another debt ceiling fight, or maybe by January next year. So this is not the last that we've heard of debt ceiling and federal spending. Republicans obviously want to cut federal spending. Federal spending gets cut, GDP growth is going to slow. So, I think this is going to be a much bigger deal going into the fall and winter.
So, Mike, real quick question, following up on that, what do you think are going to be the global issues tied back to this? We're looking at that. BRICS Plus trying to do everything that they're trying to do, but at the same time, China also not having the liquidity to back up. They're kind of they're on an all hat, no cattle kind of situation with some of the stuff that they're dealing with. Plus, we're also looking at major disruption of commerce with Taiwan coming around. We're looking at Eastern Europe flaring up. We're looking at a lot of increased disruption there in Africa over natural resources. I mean, could we be looking at just continuing like an 18-month recession globally, or could we be looking at a slow slide towards depression?
Well, depression is interesting you bring that up, because if you look at what's happening with the M2 money supply right now, it's contracting at levels that we've seen during previous depressions. Not quite at the level of the Great Depression, but same level as financial panics, like 1918, I think, was one. And so, we are actually, I was just talking to Harrison this morning about M2 contraction of the M2 money supply, and that is causing liquidity problems. One thing I've noticed over the past 3 years, just from following the research of investment banks, going into COVID, they really undersold the effects of the lockdowns. And it was week after week, they would continually downward revise their expectations. Going in, after the lockdowns, going into the recovery, they week to week oversold the economic recovery. And so we get more downward revisions on the recovery and economic growth coming out of that. I can't help but wonder if they're kind of slow pedaling this in the same way they've done the past two big economic shifts. I agree with you that there are also some geopolitical considerations. Obviously the Black Sea grain deal, if that doesn't get renewed, it looks like it's not. If that doesn't get renewed in Ukraine, then Russian grain and fertilizer is not going to be leaving the port of Odessa. We have a potential scenario where Ukraine could potentially lash out and strike some of those Russian grain ships. And so, that's kind of like a left field kind of thing, but it's not, the likelihood's not zero. And so that's just one example of how we could actually have some substantial global instability in the coming months. We look at, it's funny, the House Republicans, this may actually been a bipartisan effort by Republicans and Democrats, but they want to fund a feasibility study for the United States to U.S. Navy to conduct a naval blockade of China. If China, and I know, and Max and I were talking about it, and it's just bonkers insane, but they want to do a feasibility study on that. And apparently maybe that may be a course of action for when China does start to conduct military operations on Taiwan. Kind of on that topic as well, Taiwan recently, I think yesterday, said that they were going to attack any Chinese naval vessels or aircraft that violates their airspace. And so China, the People's Liberation Army Navy, the PLAN, they have been conducting operations, getting pretty up close and personal with Taiwanese airspace. So, I think that's kind of another one of those left field possibilities that literally within a few minutes, you go from kind of situation normal to massive problems geopolitically with the U.S. and foreign markets. So there's a lot of kind of those not quite black swans, but balloon burst opportunities out there.
So real quick, for all of our viewers out there, if you guys are not familiar with Mike Shelby here from in the Forward Observer Group, I'm here to tell you that these guys are probably one of the better private intelligence groups that I've ever seen. And this is going to be, Mike, this is just an absolute shameless plug for you. You kicked me in the butt when I first came across you guys and reminded me that I was supposed to be running an S2 cell. So if you're not performing local area intelligence operations prior to things going bad, and actually organizing that, then you're an absolute fool and you are missing out big time. And honestly, if you subscribe to Mike Shelby and the guys here at Forward Observer and the Gray Zone Intelligence Group, I'm telling you, these guys have got their act together. And the big point of this whole thing being is and Chris, I know you've heard me preach this before because Mike, you kicked me in the teeth on this one as well, was the 60-30-10 method for intelligence. In particular, you should only be spending, and I see this is endemic in the prepper community. You should only be spending 10% of your intelligence time looking at geopolitical and worldwide stuff. Okay, you can't control any of those things. You can't affect those things, but you do need to stay, in touch with those things. You need to be cognizant of them, and just getting the information from Mike and the guys here on a daily basis, getting your daily sit reps has freed up so much of my time for doing local intelligence studies. So yeah, shameless plug to our friends here at Forward Observer. And if you're not looking at that, you really should.
Definitely.
I appreciate that, Mike.
Of course. I want to take a quick break from the panel and discuss our top comment from last week's video. Now, if you remember, our last survival dispatch news was about the top 10 skills for urban survival in SHTF. And if you missed it, make sure you check it out here in the annotated video. But our comment is from Jeff B5781. And he says, I respect the skills you guys have, but this is way too much for most people. If one has to be proficient in all of these skills, which he says most Navy SEALs don't even know all this stuff, you're talking Mad Max and virtually nobody survives, but the most brutal animal humans. I believe in solid preparing, but this is over the top. Jeff, thank you for that comment. I really appreciate it. And one thing I want to emphasize from this is, we don't expect you to know everything. We understand that there is only so many hours in the day. There's only so much you can do, but we think it's a good idea that you have a solid grasp on at least some of these principles and skills. And the other thing is, a lot of these skills you can pick up passively. When we're talking about street smarts or situational awareness, that's something that you just kind of build on over time. I'm not expecting you to go out to a handyman, convention and learn how to build a hanging garden or your own house out in the wilderness next week. Okay, it's something that you will build on over time, but there's skills that will be very useful and things that you could start working on now. I noticed a lot of our commenters and replies to this comment said, that's what a MAG is for, a mutual assistant group, and that's a great point. We understand that no one can be a master of all trades, but during SHTF, the more varied your skills are, the better off your chances for survival. And again, Jeff, thank you for bringing up that comment. And I want to take a special moment to thank all of our commenters on our last video who listed their top 10 skills that they would start practicing for urban survival in SHTF. You guys are awesome. Keep on commenting, and let's get back to the video. All right, so we got off on a little tangent there. Let's bring it back. Mike, what's our next issue we need to talk about? No, I appreciate it, Mike Sterling. It was a good question and something I think that really added a lot of value. So I think our viewers will appreciate that.
Yeah. So there are other potentially tactical level decisions with catastrophic or strategic consequences. But the next thing I'm really looking at, probably coinciding, maybe even triggering a recession, is the next financial crisis. And there's been a lot of talk about commercial real estate, and you look at areas like San Francisco and other places where you have occupancy rates of like 30% in some of those buildings. And so they're declining values. The commercial real estate companies, are not making the money they once did. They don't have the cash flow. The problem is, they go to sell some of these real estate properties. They may not be worth what they actually bought it for. So they could be looking at losses. The next big thing too is in the next 2 years, there's about $1.5 trillion of commercial real estate loans that will need to be refinanced. We're looking at higher rates. We're looking at lower property values. So there is the potential there. Well, actually, as Mike Sterling mentioned, credit rationing, these banks are raising their credit standards. And so there's just not enough money to go around. And so it does concern me quite a bit looking at, what's going to happen to these commercial real estate companies and not just CRE loans, but also construction loans. And so you look at, and my particular concern is, I'm not that concerned about San Francisco. Some of these real estate, if there is like a commercial real estate type collapse, obviously cities like San Francisco are going to be hit hardest. But what I really want to focus on is the contagion risk. Where's that spilling over into? And these regional banks nationally, regional banks have anywhere between 18 to 30% of their assets tied up in commercial real estate loans. And so if there is a CRE crisis, these regional banks are going to be on the hook. And so, just looking from a preparedness perspective, where do you have your money? Is it in a regional bank that has massive exposure to commercial real estate? And, just for me, like that's kind of the a contagion risk that we're following day to day here at Forward Observer.
Yeah, I think it's a good point because a lot of us don't think about these things, right? I think it's easy in the prepping community to be like, oh, whatever, commercial loans, I don't have to deal with that because I don't own a business. But, Mike, you kind of touched on that with the contagion risk of it spreading to your bank and things like this. So this can obviously cause a lot of mental, concern for people and financial concern as well. I mean, we saw with Silicon Valley what happened. Now, that was a different situation. It wasn't necessarily commercial real estate, but this is something that could happen similar. And we have, potential runs on the banks. I'm not going to say go get your money out now. That's not what I'm suggesting, because that you could create a run on the bank, which we don't want to do. And we are not here to give financial advice, just FYI. But Dr. Jen, what are your thoughts on this? Because, I mean, this is a big thing. The banking system here in the United States seems rather fragile.
Yeah, I'm definitely not an expert on this, and it's a really interesting problem. I mean, just from a bigger perspective, people are worried about, paying their medical bills, going bankrupt from that, that just the amount of money that people spend on healthcare is ridiculous. I actually wanted to get back to one thing that I thought was important that Mike said on his tangent, which was that, I had no idea how big of a problem supply chain was going to be until COVID hit. I mean, things that we didn't even think about, like, it was never even a thought that it would be almost impossible to get a part for a common refrigerator. We got stuck in Utah for 2 weeks because our DEF pump went out in our truck and you can't drive it. And I'm like, really, that's like a really common thing to have happen. There was one aftermarket DEF pump in the country. UPS lost it. They found it later, but we were literally stranded for 2.5 weeks because there was no DEF pump. And so I think resilience is super important, not only from a mental health standpoint, but also from a financial standpoint and just a basic living standpoint. And one of the things that this taught me was that you have to be able to be really creative and be able to adapt to whatever is happening. If you can't get certain supplies, then you need to figure out, what to do. And certainly pooling resources and coming together as a prepper community, we all have different skills. We all have different, resources, and just, coming together and helping each other out, I think is super important.
No, it's a really good point. Obviously, if we have a commercial, collapse or something like that happens, we have a real estate bubble, and a lot of these companies start, having to lay people off. It's going to be even harder to get those spare parts, things that you need, whether it be medicines, parts for your car, refrigerator. Maybe you need some lumber. Remember what happened to plywood during 2020? Is simple things like that, like you said, Dr. Jen, that we just take for granted. It's good to have at least a couple of these spare parts on hand if you need them. Now, I'm not saying you need to go buy out every piece that could go out on your truck or something like that, but just having some simple hand tools around and having a little bit of experience working with these things so that maybe you can fix a problem if it comes up. All right, Mike, what are your thoughts on the commercial real estate issue?
So one thing that I actually had a question for Dr. Jen, was with the increase in the commercialization of medical care, going back to Mike's point with possible loss of commercial real estate and the increase in the cost of just doing medicine. Could we see a reduction in available care from your
100%.
standpoint?
We already have, like, lots and lots of regional and critical access hospitals are going under. One of the things that has happened was you know, the margin for hospitals is really low. It's like 1%. And when you start, you know, especially when the government stops reimbursing at a rate that covers costs, these little hospitals can't survive. They literally cannot survive. If you have a big system where, you know, one is profitable and another isn't, they can kind of help each other out. But these small little regional care facilities that, you know, good people in the farming communities and everything else rely on are going out of business. And it's a huge concern. You know, medicine, I think that the medical industry is one of the most at-risk industries. And I'll tell you, it's not getting better. And one of the things that concerns me too is that they're starting to replace physicians with newly minted physician assistants and other people who really don't have the training and experience to take care of you well. And so that's a huge concern. I agree.
I've actually seen a couple of instances where you've got part of the medical industry that they basically got run out of mainstream medicine because of, you know, saying, hey, look, I'm not gonna take, you know, COVID vaccines or something like that, and they're opening their own little community clinics specifically, you know, to service these holes in the service world. And it's funny, you know, nature abhors a vacuum, and it's funny watching the preparedness groups out there, the mags and stuff. Almost exclusively, from what I've seen, these little clinics are all parts of the people in the clinics are parts of mutual assistance groups, and that's a beautiful thing to see.
I agree. I totally agree. One of the things that I thought was really funny, well, not funny, but horrific and interesting, was when some of these places fired people who wouldn't take the COVID shot, but then were so understaffed, had to take people who actually had active COVID and made them work. I like, great plan, guys. That worked out really well.
Yeah, my wife is a nurse, and she had to kind of deal with that as well. You know, even in the big hospitals, they're like, oh, if you you know been, you know, mostly asymptomatic for a couple of days, you can come back. It's all good.
Yeah,
it's totally fine.
Yeah. Don't worry about those pustules. You'll be fine.
Yeah, right.
That's monkeypox.
Yeah. Change your socks. Take these 2 800-milligram Motrin. Drink a bottle of water. Go back to work.
Exactly. You'll be fine.
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
Add one more, if I can add one more threat on the topic of healthcare.
Yeah.
Because, you know, especially in our community, you know, there are a lot of aging folks, and there was a hospital in a regional medical facility in Illinois that shut down last week due to a ransomware attack. And someone clicked on an email, clicked a link they shouldn't have, and it's just spread throughout the hospital system network, encrypted their computers, and they went out of business. They either couldn't afford to pay the ransom, or they just said, we're not going to pay it. And so, you know, there's some of the human interest stories where, you know, oh, now, you know, this person has to drive 45 minutes to the next nearest hospital. And so, you know, when Mike earlier was talking about the importance of doing an area study, you know, I just wrote a book called the Area Intelligence Handbook. And, you know, that's the kind of local infrastructure that we need to take note of. What happens if, you know, this is the only medical facility within an hour of where you live, and for whatever reason, you know, probably low risk, but high impact, you know, it goes down, and, you know, what are the options? So I also think that's a pretty practical thing to include in your area studies. What happens if medical infrastructure around you fails?
Now, this is a really good rabbit hole, and I'm kind of liking this. So let's keep following it down. So Dr. Jen, obviously you're our doctor here. So what are some things that people can do, you know, if something like this happens? Let's kind of spitball this for a second. Let's say that your hospital or your doctor's office gets completely wiped out by a cyber attack. What are some things you can do to kind of insulate yourself from that type of disaster?
Well, I mean, it's not ideal, but so much in medicine isn't, but there's always telehealth. There are like mail-in prescriptions, things like that. So, you know, I don't really, I'll just give you one piece of advice, and that is, if you want to live a long life, avoid the medical system. I joke, but I don't joke.
No, I understand.
seriously, like just learning how to take care of yourself. There are so many medical errors, and every procedure comes with risk. So I really tell people, you want to, just like you're trying to optimize your preparedness, you want to optimize your body's preparedness too. And, trying to learn how to stay healthy. I personally keep things at home so I don't have to go to the hospital. This is not medical advice. Don't sue me, but things that are so simple, like, cleaning out a wound and stitching it up. Those things are pretty simple to do. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to do it. But just trying to avoid the health system by staying healthy. And then, if it's an option and it's not an emergency and you don't need an emergency procedure, maybe telehealth isn't a bad way to go.
No, it's great advice. I think, another thing is like having some of those things on hand, like gauze and things like that. A quick personal story. I was working on the garage this weekend, and I took a stumble in the garage, put my shin right into a propane canister, and gave myself a nice little cut on the leg. And I'm not going to show any pictures. I know you don't all want to see that, but we'll just say that the wife had to work on it quite a bit to get everything under control. So having those things available, having those gauze, those bandages, those things that you would need to treat something like that, is really important as far as preparedness is concerned, because you're going to burn through it a lot faster than you think. Yeah.
I want to just throw in a quick plug. So I fly out a week from Friday to do the Surviving Man All-Star shoot in Belize. And one of the sponsors is a company called Stop Bleed. And this is one of the coolest, most innovative, simple, cheap products I've ever seen. Unlike Quick Clot that is super painful and has to be removed from the wound, Stop Bleed is it's a sheet. You can tear it, do whatever you need to do with it. It will cover the wound. It'll stop bleeding. It's a really great product. You don't have to worry about infection underneath of it. So for a lot of simple things, burns, blisters, things like that, it's a really easy, cheap way to take care of things at home by yourself. The other thing is it's a great thing for an active shooter. If you use the tourniquet, for example, you are stopping all downstream flow to that limb and potentially risking that limb. And it's also painful as hell. If you've ever had even a blood pressure cuff too tight for a minute, you're like, yeah, get that thing off of me. Imagine a tourniquet for minutes to hours, whatever. So the Stop Bleed actually just creates, allows the platelets and things to go to where the bleeding is, and it doesn't disrupt any of the other vasculature. So it's something to look into. Just, look it up. You can get it on Amazon. It's over the counter. It's super easy, but it's a really important thing to have at home.
That's some great advice. Absolutely. All right, Mike, what else is on your radar at Forward Observer?
Well, we covered a little bit of this earlier, but geopolitical risk. So, obviously it was a wild weekend in Russia, and, that appears to have settled down quite a bit now. However, we're still looking at some U.S. officials pressuring the Biden administration to provide it's called the Army Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS, to Ukraine. And U.S. officials, I should say, I guess maybe former generals like Ben Hodges, Army retired Lieutenant Colonel, excuse me, not Lieutenant Colonel, I just demoted him, Lieutenant General, rather. He wants the U.S. to provide ATACMS to Ukraine because that's going to put the Ukrainian army within range of Crimea. And if anyone who studied any kind of Russian nuclear doctrine knows, there's like 4 reasons why Russia would use nuclear weapons. And one of those is attacks against Russian territory. Well, Russia annexed Crimea. And so that probably is, or that may end up being a red line that Russia tries to enforce us through maybe a tactical nuclear weapon against Kiev, which, again, seems like fairly low probability. But one thing that we have seen with the Biden administration is they really slow walk kind of escalating military equipment. So, at first the Biden administration said, well, we're not going to provide Abrams tanks, but we're going to give them Bradleys. Okay, well, if you understand U.S. Army warfighting doctrine, you know that Bradleys and Abrams tanks are going to go hand in hand. So then we saw the Europeans come out and said, yeah, we'll give them our Leopard 2 tanks. And then Biden said, well, okay, well, if you're going to give them tanks, we'll give them the Abrams. And so, they're kind of doing the same thing on F-16s right now. And, it may be the case that Biden actually does provide ATACMS to Ukraine. And what happens when Ukraine starts launching these missiles towards Russian naval ships? I mean, their Black Sea fleet is right there in Sevastopol. So the big question is, does that escalate things? And is Russia going to use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine? And then what are the domestic effects of that? Because there are U.S. officials that say this is a situation where they're going to pressure the Biden administration to go tit for tat with nuclear weapons with Russia, which just seems absolutely insane. But it's 2023. So we kind of have to identify some of the kind of second, third, fourth order, fourth, fifth order effects here domestically. But that's a geopolitical shock that could throw a lot of things into a tailspin here at home.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right, Mike, on that one. There's definitely a lot of angst right now with the mission creep that we're seeing in Eastern Europe. Everyone remembers the famous quote, right, from Biden, if we provide F-16s, what's that? We call that World War III. That's his big quote. And now, of course, that's what we're talking about doing. So it definitely is making a lot of concern and ripples in the prepper community. Being prepared for that is something in the past we kind of like wrote off, like, oh yeah, right, yeah, nuclear war is never going to happen. But now we're actually staring it in the face. I would say that we're, probably pretty close to the tension level that we had at the Cuban Missile Crisis, from what I've seen. So, Mike, you've been in the military for quite some time. What are your thoughts on this entire situation in Eastern Europe?
So, to Mike's point, when it comes down to Russian use of nuclear weapons, the Russians have got two different categories for nuclear weapon use, and their battlefield nuclear weapons, they were actually way out ahead of us on the miniaturization side for nuke weapons, and they actually have sub-kiloton battlefield nukes, and they don't understand why everybody in the West freaks out about them, because they don't actually consider it a nuke. And we're only talking, like I said, 1/2 kiloton type device. And for reference, the devices at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were between 12 and 20 kilotons. So we're talking something that's going to wreck like 10 city blocks and really not dump a whole hell of a lot of radiation. But the West still sees a nuke as a nuke as a nuke as a nuke as a nuke. And we put them all into one box, and that's it. The Russians don't understand that. They never have. That was doctrine going all the way back into the Soviet days. Battlefield nukes are an option, and they just don't understand why everybody freaks out about it when they want to use something little itty bitty tiny like that. The good part is, until you start using strategic nukes, you're not going to wind up seeing major issues with climate. You're not going to wind up seeing nuclear winter or anything like that. The stuff that's going to cause those type of effects are when you start dropping either surface or subsurface grounders. And usually it's the big stuff trying to tunnel out everybody else's either command and control facilities or nuclear silos. That's I mean, if they pace the Dakotas and Montana and Wyoming, that's how you get huge disruptions in the world. And everybody talks about, oh, I've got to get my potassium iodide. Well, for one, that's for radioactive iodine 131 to 135, 36, somewhere around there. And the vast majority of nuclear devices don't release radioactive iodine. That's predominantly an after effect off of a fated giant type event, which is a nuclear reactor meltdown type situation. So yeah, I'm with you, Mike. They need to really take a good close look at this. Everybody, I know it's slower, but people get, people up in the powers that be, they get so wrapped around what they're looking at here. They keep on looking at that 50-meter target, and they keep forgetting the 300-meter target. And it's like, okay, guys, you got to slow down, have some patience, let the combat, let it pare out. If we lose Ukraine, the Ukrainians gave it their best shot. They can take, I mean, the Russians can potentially take Ukraine. And Mike, you've said this about 1 billion times. They can't hold it. Nobody can hold that place. I mean, congratulations. Welcome to Vietnam. There's no way you're going to hold that place. So yeah, it would be a Pyrrhic victory in and of itself. But
yeah, if I can, I don't, maybe confusing me with someone else. I don't think I've said that.
Well, I mean, we've discussed it. I mean, they could take that part of Ukraine.
Oh yeah, I think the Russians could press further if this Ukrainian counteroffensive fails, and I mean that's like the last of the remnants of the Ukrainian army. I think we could potentially see a more successful Russian counter offensive.
Right.
If that happens.
Yeah, that was what I meant. Is they can take the the portion that they're working on, but they can't hold it. I mean, well, not without pouring bodies into it, which, well, the Russians do tend to be happy to do.
Their typical operating procedure, SOP. So, all right, cool. Dr. Jen, with regards to everything going on in Eastern Europe, what are you looking at? What are your concerns as far as that is, a possibility?
I'd just get back to food and supply chain issues again. And then, I mean, this isn't really a medical thing, but I'm a little bit worried about our military preparedness, having given away so many of our assets and resources. But really, I think just going back to Mike Sterling's comment, you just have to be prepared for anything, things that you never thought were possible, like the supply chain things I never thought were possible. Well, just, again, it just comes back to resilience, and whatever happens, you have to deal with it. And so as prepared as you can be is great, and then improvise as you need to. And I think this community is really great and helpful to one another, but the grain is a huge, huge deal. And fertilizer is a huge deal. So, just being prepared to deal with that, and just think about it, not in a way that you're anxious and, oh God, is this going to happen? That going to happen? I mean, you just live for today, but make sure that, you're prepared. And I don't like the idea of being paranoid and all of that. I do like the idea of being prepared and then dealing with things as they happen, if they happen.
It's a great point you make, because I think that there's so much angst right now in the preparedness community. Like, oh, what happens if they do use a tactical nuke, or what if World War III kicks off? That's the big catchphrase right now, in the prepper community. And it's like, well, if you're prepping, you shouldn't be so worried about it. That's the whole point of doing it, guys and gals, is just to be prepared for these situations so that you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about where your next meal is going to come from. You don't have to worry about, what if this happens? What if that happens? You've got your supplies, you've got your people that you can trust around you, and you're going to be okay. Now, for me, as far as things going down in Eastern Europe, and with the, what Dr. Jen was talking about, how many things we've been sending over there, maybe picking up a couple extra boxes of ammunition might not be the worst idea. I don't see the prices coming down on that anytime soon. And if you're a reloader like myself and you've seen the price of primers lately, it kind of makes you, grab your heart a little bit, and your blood pressure goes up a little. But having some of those things on hand, because if we do get involved, a lot of production capability is going to be shifted to the war effort. So, ammunition may be incredibly hard to come by. If I recall, the last time we were in a world war, it was incredibly hard to come by. So having some of those put away and stored properly, I know, Mike Sterling, you're big on, storing your ammo properly. And we want to talk about that sometime later, but, just having that in the back burner, a great thing to have just in case, because you may not be able to get it in the future as easily.
I'd agree that, it's great if you have a bunch of supplies until someone comes and takes them.
Well, that's the whole idea of having that extra ammunition so that they can.
Right. Yeah. So, but, one of the things that I did over COVID, and as the ammo became so expensive, is I ended up doing a lot more, scenario training, dry fire practice, and all of that, which is really useful. I mean, really can improve your skills even more sometimes than going out and shooting $1,000 worth of ammo.
Well, the nice thing is if you do need ammo, make sure you get it at ammo.com, guys. We've got some great prices for you if you do like that live fire practice. But definitely dry fire is a great way to build those skills before you go to the range and do some live fire practice. A really inexpensive thing to do that really kind of gets that trigger control and trigger discipline down so that you can make that training at the range count as much as possible. All right, Mike, do you have anything else for us, or is that, kind of where you guys are looking right now?
Well, if you want to go strategic, big picture, long term, Mike Sterling talked about BRICS Plus, and we're probably going to see BRICS expand at some point, maybe as soon as August with the annual BRICS summit. Could be later in the year, but they are trying to hammer out those exact rules on how they bring other countries on. And so we've seen this from Brazilian President Lula da Silva. He is really big on de-dollarization. He says it doesn't make any sense for these countries to be buying dollars just to do international trade. Let's just do bilateral currency trades. And so that is going to reduce some demand, some international demand for the dollar. That's also going to could potentially weaken the dollar. I think actually this is probably part of China's strategy. I don't think they want the digital renminbi to replace the dollar as the global standard of trade. They just want to displace the dollar, remove like maybe 20 to 40% of global trade off the dollar. And so that, depending on how rapidly that happens, it could be catastrophic to our money. But I always go back to the JP Morgan study. They did a 600-year study of world reserve currencies, and they found that currencies last as the world reserve for on average 80 to 100 years. So we go back to Bretton Woods in 1944, you add 80, you get 2024, you add 100, you get 2044. So we are probably 20 years out from the dollar losing world reserve currency status. And that's going to affect our quality of life and standard of living. And so, for me, that's a big part of my thinking is, what is this shift going to look like? And what are we using to trade locally, if not dollars?
That's a really good point. Obviously, if that type of thing were to happen, and I think we're seeing it happen very slowly, countries moving away from the dollar, which is, slightly concerning. Definitely dollars coming home would equal inflation, in my opinion. So that's obviously a bad thing and that we kind of need to prepare for. So, having some of that stuff on hand ready to go. But Dr. Jen, from a medical perspective with inflation, obviously, you already mentioned it, medical prices are going nuts right now, but is there anything that you would look for in case, the currency starts to weaken?
Boy, I think it just gets back to the fragility of the entire system and being prepared for that and having alternatives for care. One of the things that is a little bit distressing for our patients is, there's always a balance between research and development and prices, but our population sees the highest prices around the world, which seems really unfair. But just having things on hand that are expensive if they have a good shelf life, and maybe having a supply of that to get you through this. But everything has to level out over time, right? It's that short-term period of time where there's a big disruption that you have to be prepared for. So, if you have the ability, and then again, just pooling resources with people, I think is important.
No, you make a good point. As Mike was talking about, obviously countries go through this, currencies go through this. The GBP used to be the British Great Pound, the pound. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Lost its global reserve currency, but it's still around. So, it'll still hold value. I don't want people thinking we're going full Venezuela here, but obviously there could be some loss of buying power with that dollar if something like that were to happen. So, Mike Sterling, what are your thoughts on this?
So I'm with a good doctor on that. Having not only the long-term use materials and stuff that not only you can use, but you can trade. Local barter economies are not necessarily a bad thing, but another thing that you can trade very, very well is skills. If you've, like we've talked about it before, knowledge outweighs gear virtually every time. Now, granted, you do have to have some tools to work with, but like our mag out here is very medically heavy, and we've worked together with a lot of things, and you know, I've talked with you about it before, Chris, but one of the things that we did was we've got a couple people that are senior people, but they basically brought a whole bunch of us together, and we ran a couple of weekends worth of classes for assistance with prolonged care for people, so that, you know, those main core people, they're the ones constantly running medical, but then the rest of us essentially would wind up assisting them with additional help. So that's just a great example of being able to do that. And if you can provide those, you know, possible medical services, even if it's just for, you know, hey, you know, this guy cut his leg open while he was working on the yard, and there's no other medical support available. Well, we can take care of that medical, you know, we can, you know, assist you with medical support on that sort of thing locally. But yeah, skills are a huge thing, and like we've talked about before, if you can fix something, if you can maintain something, that automatically puts you a couple of rungs up. I mean, that is a big thing.
No, it really is. You look at, you know, back in the Great Depression, things like that, reusing things, being more resourceful with what you have. You know, if your money is going less, can buy you less than what you had before, you need to make sure that you can repurpose things. Or if you have the skills to fix it your own, that's a really good asset to have. So something to work on now. Knowledge is pretty much free on the internet. You can find pretty much anything you need to kind of start working on that. So kind of identify some skills that you have that maybe you could start building up a little bit. I'm not saying you got to start a side hustle and monetize everything, but just something that you know how to do to, you know, really help elevate your community is a great thing to do in case we see some type of inflationary event or period of time that we have to live through. So, wow, that was an excellent talk. I want to thank everybody for coming out today and our panelists. It was great having you all on the show. We're looking forward to having Mike and Dr. Jen back again. Thank you so much, both of you, for coming on today.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, it was great. Now, for everybody who made it this far in the video, make sure you get down in the comment section. Let us know what things are you watching and how would you prepare for them. I want to hear from you. So with that, stay safe out there, and we'll catch you on the next one.